The crisp December air nipped at George's cheeks as he stepped out of the post office in Cedar Falls, Iowa. The small Midwestern town was already decked out for Christmas, with twinkling lights adorning storefronts and wreaths hanging from lampposts. George pulled his postal cap down tighter, bracing against the cold as he set out on his daily route. As he rounded the corner onto Maple Street, George caught a flash of movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned to see a scruffy, medium-sized dog trotting along the sidewalk, keeping pace with him about 10 yards back. The dog's coat was a mottled mix of brown and black, matted in places and hanging loose on its thin frame. George shook his head and continued on his way, focusing on the task at hand. He had a long day ahead of him, with holiday cards and packages filling his satchel to the brim. But as he made his way down the street, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time he glanced back, there was the dog maintaining that same distance, its eyes fixed on George. By the time George reached Oak Avenue, he was starting to feel unnerved. He quickened his pace, hoping to lose his canine shadow. But the dog matched his speed effortlessly, never gaining ground but never falling behind either. George muttered under his breath, expressing his confusion about the dog's persistence. As the morning wore on, George found himself constantly aware of the dog's presence. He'd stop at a house, deliver the mail, and there it would be, waiting patiently at the end of the driveway. The residents he encountered along his route began to notice too. Mrs. Johnson chuckled as she accepted her mail, commenting on George's new canine companion. George forced a smile and replied with feigned nonchalance, dismissing the dog as a persistent stray. By the end of his shift, George was exhausted and irritated. The dog had followed him for his entire route, never approaching closer than a few yards, but never leaving either. As George headed back to the post office, he breathed a sigh of relief when he realized the dog had finally disappeared. The next morning, George stepped out into a world blanketed in fresh snow. The temperature had dropped overnight, and his breath formed little clouds in the frigid air. He stamped his feet, trying to get the blood flowing, as he started down the sidewalk. He'd made it about half a block when he heard the soft crunch of paws on snow behind him. George turned, already knowing what he'd see. Sure enough, there was the dog from yesterday, its coat dusted with snowflakes, eyes bright and alert as it watched him. George groaned in exasperation, wondering aloud why the dog didn't have somewhere else to be. The dog cocked its head, as if considering the question, then continued to follow George as he resumed his route. This pattern repeated for the next few days. Each morning, George would leave the post office, and within minutes, the dog would appear. It never approached him directly, never begged for food or attention. It just followed. A silent, persistent presence that George couldn't shake. By the fourth day, George's annoyance had begun to give way to curiosity. He found himself wondering about the dog's story. Was it truly a stray, or had it been abandoned? And why, out of all the people in Cedar Falls, had it fixated on him? As he pondered these questions, George realized he'd begun to look for the dog each morning. He found himself oddly disappointed on the rare occasions when it took more than a few minutes to appear. On the sixth day, as George was delivering mail to the Petersons' house, he heard a commotion behind him. He turned to see a group of kids on bikes, laughing and shouting as they raced down the street. The dog, which had been lying in the Petersons' front yard, leapt to its feet, clearly startled by the noise. For a moment, George thought the dog might run away, spooked by the sudden activity. Instead, it darted towards him, pressing itself against his legs, trembling slightly. Without thinking, George reached down and patted its head. George murmured reassuringly to the dog, surprised by the softness of her fur beneath the grime. The dog looked up at him, her brown eyes full of trust, and George felt something shift inside him. From that day on, George began to bring food with him on his route. Nothing fancy, just some kibble he'd picked up at the corner store. The first time he held out a handful to the dog, she approached cautiously, sniffing his hand before gently taking the food. As she ate, George got his first good look at her. She was thinner than he'd initially realized, her ribs visible beneath her coat. Despite her obvious hunger, she ate slowly, glancing up at George between bites as if to make sure he was still there. George decided to name the dog Hazel, thinking the name suited her well. Hazel wagged her tail at the sound of her new name, and George couldn't help but smile. Over the next few days, feeding Hazel became a regular part of George's routine. He'd stop at a quiet spot along his route, usually the small park on Elm Street, and Hazel would emerge from wherever she'd been waiting to eat and spend a few minutes with him. George found himself looking forward to these brief interactions. He'd never had a dog of his own. His apartment building didn't allow pets, but he was starting to understand the appeal. There was something comforting about Hazel's steady presence, her unwavering loyalty. However, George began to notice something odd about Hazel's behavior. While she would follow him for most of his route, she never strayed far from a particular 4-block radius centered around Pine Street. If George's route took him beyond this area, Hazel would stop at the boundary, watching him go with sad eyes before turning back. George tried to coax her to follow him further, curious about what was keeping her tethered to this specific area, but Hazel remained resolute. She would wag her tail, clearly wanting to go with him, but something always held her back. This behavior puzzled George. He found himself studying the area more closely, wondering what significance it held for Hazel. Was there someone else feeding her? A place she considered home? But no matter how much he observed, he couldn't figure it out. As the days passed, George also noticed that Hazel seemed to be trying to tell him something. She would often bark and run a short distance in a particular direction, then turn back to see if George was following. At first, he dismissed it as playful behavior, but the frequency and intensity of these actions made him wonder if there was more to it. One particularly cold morning, about 10 days after Hazel had first appeared, George noticed she seemed more agitated than usual. Her barks were more insistent, and she kept running ahead, looking back at him with what he could only describe as desperation in her eyes. George was tempted to follow her to see what she was so eager to show him, but he was already running behind schedule, and he knew his supervisor wouldn't accept "I was following a stray dog" as an excuse for late deliveries. George apologized to Hazel, his heart heavy as he turned away from her pleading eyes. He explained that he had to finish his route, promising to perhaps follow her the next day. Hazel whined softly but didn't follow as George continued on his way. He glanced back to see her sitting in the snow, watching him go, and felt a pang of guilt. That evening, as George settled in his modest apartment, his thoughts kept circling back to Hazel. She'd followed him every day for over a week now, her presence as reliable as the ticking of the clock. But this morning had been different. There was urgency in her behavior, a desperation that gnawed at George's mind. His phone buzzed on the counter, pulling him from his thoughts. It was his sister. Her voice on the other end was calm but firm. "George, it's about Mom. She's been asking if you'll come visit soon. You know she worries about you being so alone out there." George sighed, guilt tugging at him. He hadn't seen his mother in months, and every phone call ended with the same refrain, promises to visit that he hadn't kept. "I'll try to find time, really," he said, glancing at the calendar on the wall. "Work's been busy. Just think about it, okay?" She replied. "Mom could use the company, and I think you could too." As George hung up, he couldn't shake his sister's words. He stared out the window at the snowy street below, his thoughts drifting back to Hazel. He saw something of his mother in the dog's quiet persistence, watching over him from a distance, asking for nothing, yet offering everything. For a moment, George considered what his sister had said, but Hazel's anxious barks from that morning echoed in his memory. Whatever Hazel needed, it was urgent. George resolved to follow her the next day. He couldn't leave unanswered whatever it was that had been pulling at her, and, in a way, pulling at him too. As the first light of dawn broke over Cedar Falls, George stepped out of his house, his postal uniform crisp despite the early morning chill. His mind was still preoccupied with thoughts of his mother's recovery. But as he walked towards the post office, he couldn't help but scan the streets for a familiar furry figure. The past few days away had given George time to reflect on the strange bond he'd formed with Hazel. He found himself hoping she was okay, wondering if she'd missed their daily encounters as much as he had. As George rounded the corner onto Maple Street, his heart leapt. There, sitting patiently on the sidewalk, was Hazel. Her tail began to wag furiously the moment she spotted him, and she trotted over, her whole body wiggling with excitement. George couldn't help but smile as he knelt down to greet her. Hazel's coat was dusted with fresh snow, and her breath came out in little puffs in the cold air. She pressed her head into his hand, clearly overjoyed at his return. As George started his route, Hazel fell into step beside him, closer than she'd ever walked before. He noticed immediately that something was different about her behavior. She seemed more agitated, constantly looking up at him and then darting ahead, only to come back and repeat the process. The usual calm companionship of their walks was replaced by a sense of urgency. Hazel's ears were perked forward, her body tense, as if ready to spring into action at any moment. She would run a few yards ahead, stop and look back at George, then bark insistently. George tried to focus on his deliveries, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Hazel was trying to tell him something important. Her behavior reminded him of the day he'd left, when she'd seemed so desperate to show him something. As the morning wore on, Hazel's agitation only increased. She barely gave George time to deliver the mail at each house before she was tugging at his pant leg, urging him to move faster. Her eyes, usually so warm and friendly, now held a look of desperation that George couldn't ignore. Finally, as George finished delivering to the last house on Pine Street, he made a decision. He couldn't bear to see Hazel in such distress any longer. Whatever she wanted to show him, he would follow her now, even if it meant being late, finishing his route. The moment George gestured for Hazel to lead the way, she took off like a shot. She raced down Pine Street, constantly looking back to make sure George was following. George jogged to keep up, his heavy mailbag bouncing against his hip. Hazel led him through a maze of snow-covered streets, some of which George had never even been down before. They passed rows of quaint houses with smoke curling from chimneys, empty playgrounds with swings swaying gently in the winter breeze, and shuttered storefronts yet to open for the day. As they ran, the streets became narrower, the houses more dilapidated. George realized they were heading into one of the older, less maintained parts of town. Hazel darted down an alley between two abandoned buildings, barely more than a gap between crumbling brick walls. The alley was dark and cold, sheltered from the weak winter sunlight. Piles of trash and old furniture lined the walls, dusted with a layer of fresh snow. George hesitated at the entrance, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up, but Hazel's insistent barking drew him forward. About halfway down the alley, Hazel stopped next to a large cardboard box, partially hidden behind a rusted dumpster. The box was soggy from melted snow, its edges frayed and collapsing. George approached cautiously, unsure of what he might find. As he drew closer, he heard a faint whimpering sound coming from inside the box. His heart racing, George carefully peeled back the damp cardboard flaps. Inside, nestled together in a tiny ball of fur, were 5 newborn puppies. Their eyes were still closed, their little bodies shivering in the cold. They couldn't have been more than a few days old. George's breath caught in his throat as he realized the full extent of Hazel's predicament. She wasn't just a stray dog that had taken a liking to him. She was a mother, desperately seeking help for her vulnerable puppies. Without hesitation, George shrugged off his coat and gently wrapped it around the shivering puppies. He looked at Hazel, who was watching him intently, her tail wagging slowly, as if in approval. "Oh, Hazel," George whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Why didn't you bring me here sooner?" As if in response, Hazel nuzzled George's hand, then turned to look down the alley. George followed her gaze and noticed a small gap in the wall of one of the buildings, just big enough for a dog to squeeze through. He realized that Hazel must have been keeping her puppies there, only moving them to the box when the cold became too intense. George knew he had to act fast. The puppies were dangerously cold and they needed food and warmth immediately. But he couldn't just abandon his postal route. His mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Then he remembered Mrs. Stewart, the kindly widow who lived a few blocks away. She was always talking about her late husband's veterinary practice and how much she missed having animals around. George made a decision, hoping Mrs. Stewart would be home and willing to help. Carefully cradling the box with the puppies, George set off towards Mrs. Stewart's house, Hazel trotting anxiously by his side. As they walked, he could feel the tiny bodies starting to warm up against his chest. The snow crunched under their feet, and George's breath came out in puffs of white in the frigid air. When they reached Mrs. Stewart's house, a quaint blue two-story with white trim, George hesitated. What if she wasn't home? What if she didn't want to help? But Hazel nudged his leg, as if sensing his doubt, and George found the courage to climb the porch steps. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding. After a moment that felt like an eternity, he heard shuffling inside. The door opened, and Mrs. Stewart's eyes widened in surprise at the sight before her. George, the mailman, holding a box of puppies with a scruffy dog at his side. George quickly explained the situation, his words tumbling out in a rush. He apologized for the intrusion and described how Hazel had been following him and the discovery of her puppies. He expressed his desperation and hope for Mrs. Stewart's help. Mrs. Stewart's surprise turned to concern as she took in the situation. She glanced at Hazel, who was looking up at her with pleading eyes, then back at George. Her expression softened, and she quickly ushered them inside, away from the cold. She guided them into the living room, which was cozy, with well-worn furniture and photos of smiling faces lining the walls. Mrs. Stewart cleared a space on the floor, laying down some old blankets, and instructed George to place the box there. As George set the box down, Mrs. Stewart knelt beside it, gently examining each puppy. She reassured George about their condition and gave him instructions to warm up some milk and bring clean towels. While George hurried to follow her instructions, Mrs. Stewart turned her attention to Hazel. She spoke soothingly to the anxious mother dog, offering her hand for Hazel to sniff and promising to take care of her puppies. Over the next hour, George and Mrs. Stewart worked together to care for the puppies. They gently warmed them with towels, fed them warm milk from a dropper, and made sure they were comfortable. Hazel never left their side, her eyes darting between her puppies and the humans helping them. As the puppies began to show signs of improvement, Mrs. Stewart sat back on her heels with a sigh. She expressed relief that the puppies were out of danger, but noted that they would need round-the-clock care for a while. George's heart sank, realizing he couldn't provide that care due to his job and living situation. He hesitantly began to ask Mrs. Stewart if she could help, but she was already nodding in agreement before he could finish. Mrs. Stewart expressed her willingness to care for the puppies and Hazel, mentioning how long it had been since she'd had little ones to look after. She noted that Hazel looked like she could use a good meal and a warm bed, too. Sensing George's mixed emotions, Mrs. Stewart suggested that he could help with the puppy's care, stopping by after his route each day to assist with feedings and playtime. George's face lit up at the suggestion, and he agreed enthusiastically. As the puppies slept peacefully in their makeshift bed, Mrs. Stewart made tea, and she and George sat at her kitchen table, discussing the logistics of caring for Hazel and her puppies. They talked about feeding schedules, veterinary checkups, and even started brainstorming names for the little ones. Mrs. Stewart shared how she had been feeling lonely since her husband's passing, and how having Hazel and her puppies made the house feel alive again. George nodded, understanding the sense of purpose that seemed to have rejuvenated Mrs. Stewart. As the afternoon wore on, George realized he needed to finish his route. He stood reluctantly, not wanting to leave, but promised to return the next day. Mrs. Stewart walked him to the door, thanking him not just for bringing the dogs to her, but for caring enough to help Hazel in the first place. As George stepped back out into the cold, he felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. He had started this journey thinking he was helping a stray dog, but in reality, Hazel had given him something far more valuable. She had reminded him of the power of persistence, the strength of a mother's love, and the incredible capacity for trust and connection between humans and animals. George knew that his route would never be the same again. But now, instead of missing Hazel's companionship, he had something to look forward to at the end of each day. And as he resumed his postal route, George couldn't help but look at the world around him with new eyes, wondering about the secret lives of the animals he passed, the untold stories behind every wagging tail or meowing cat. Hazel had opened his eyes to a whole new world of possibilities, and for that, he would be forever grateful. And while finishing his deliveries and the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered town in hues of pink and gold, George realized that this Christmas season would be one he'd never forget, all thanks to a persistent stray dog who had chosen him as her unlikely hero. What would you do if you came across a stray dog and her newborn puppies while going about your day? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartwarming stories like this one.